Hello, it is May 29th, 2011, and I am interviewing Ted Curtis for the 1950s Racism and Segregation Against African Americans. Okay, Mr. Curtis, with all the racism going on in the 1950s, what, if anything, did you witness firsthand?
Well, Ian, the first thing that I witnessed was in 1951. I was traveling by Greyhound bus from Grand Rapids, Michigan to Albuquerque, New Mexico. And this was my first time out of the state of Michigan. And partway en route on the Greyhound bus, I saw something that was totally unfamiliar to me, had no uh, expectation of this at all. And what it was, where the bus stopped for a rest stop, uh, I was headed towards the area where the restrooms were, and I saw that there were two sets of restrooms. On over the door of one set of restroom, it said colored, and over the door of the other set of restroom, it said white. And this was quite a shock to me, coming from a little town in West Michigan, never having been around uh, people of a different color. So that was my first introduction to racism. The next thing that I ran into was in 1954. I was a member of the Taylor University football team. I was a freshman on the team, and we uh, traveled down to Nashville, Tennessee to play Fisk University. And that was the fall of 1954. And what I did not realize until many years later, when I was reading something about uh, racial problems, the game with Fisk University in the fall of 1954 was the first interracial football game played, the first interracial college football game played in the state of Tennessee. I played for Taylor University, and incidentally, we won the game 32-0.
All right.
Well,
Is there anything else that you'd like to share?
if you want me to continue talking about what I observed firsthand about racism during the 50s, I'm ready to do so. In 1959, I took my first teaching job at Redbird Mission in southeastern Kentucky, and I was the basketball coach. We played basketball games. We played 31 games that year, and we played Harlan County High School. We played Harlan Rosenwald High School. We played Middlesboro High School. We played Middlesboro Lincoln High School. This was 1959. Harlan County High School was all white. Harlan Rosenwald was all black. Middlesboro High School was all white. Middlesboro Lincoln High School was all black. It was 100 years from the time that Abraham Lincoln had freed the slaves. Another experience with racism came also in the 1950s when I was playing football for Taylor University. It was 1957, and we had been on an overnight road trip to play football. We had played the game Saturday afternoon, and we were on our way back home. Our coach had made reservations for us for meals and for lodging. We arrived at the place that we were to go to for our meal, and the manager of the restaurant observed that we had a black player. The manager called our coach aside and said, "Your black player is not allowed in our restaurant. He can eat in the kitchen. He'll get the very same menu as your team does out in our restaurant. We also found out that the place where we had reserved rooms for our entire football team, the manager came out to our coach and said, "You have a black player. Your black player may not stay uh, in our lodging facility." The black player said, "Well, coach, I'll sleep on the bus." The team collectively said, "No, no, you're with us." And so we walked away. We jumped on the bus. We gave up the meal, we gave up the lodging, and we drove all night to get back home.
Okay. Thank you for sharing that. Is there anything else you'd like to share in relation to this question?
That pretty well covers my experience uh, in the 50s, starting with 1951 with the New Mexico trip, and concluding with my experience with my basketball team in 1959.
Okay. Before the year 1960, what types of things did you see that indicated desegregation in America?
Before, did you say before 1960?
Yep.
Well, I lived in an area where there really weren't any black people. I lived in a little town in West Michigan, and I really had no dealings, any experience at all with black people other than playing sports in high school. There was, I think, only one or two teams that our school scheduled in athletics that had any black players on their team. So my exposure was very, very limited.
Okay. Tell me about the first interracial college football game in Tennessee. Tell me what you remember, the details, how you felt when you found out this was the first interracial college football game in
Okay.
Tennessee.
Okay, I'm going to kind of start with the end of the question. And I don't remember when it was, but it was years later. I was reading something, and I thought, this article is describing a football game that I played in many years ago, it being the first interracial college football game in the state of Tennessee. And I did not know that at the time. Our coach never said, "Guys, we're going to be making history here when we do this." It was never mentioned. I don't know if I was just naive and the rest of the guys know. I don't think so, because nothing was ever mentioned about this being a historical game.
Okay. Um, Thinking back to the time of this football game, how did the two different colleges view each other? Did you guys view each other as complete equals?
Uh, to me personally, and I'm assuming to my teammates, it was just another football game. Nothing really all that unique about it. Even though I had never played in a game where uh, the other team was composed entirely of blacks, and that the college was just for blacks. Now, I was a freshman. Older members of our team had played Kentucky State University the year before, and one of my teammates that I just talked to a few days ago, he said that he understood that game the year before, which was 1953, was the first interracial football game, college level, that was played in the state of Kentucky.
Okay. In your opinion, what significance did this game have in desegregation and equality in general? Any thoughts?
Well, again, it's going to have to be in retrospect, because as I stated, it was years later, and I don't know how many years later, before I knew the significance of that game. So obviously, I didn't go out of there saying, "Wow, uh, I was part of making history," because I didn't know that we were making history.
Okay. In the 1950s, do you believe that the African Americans had less rights than whites did? What did you see that indicated this?
Okay, I don't know if I mentioned this or not, but in yeah, I did mention it. In 1951 was when I first became aware that black people were treated differently than white people in some instances. On my bus trip to New Mexico, where I saw that there were restrooms that were labeled colored people and restrooms that were labeled white, and that was my first awareness. Living in a small town where everybody was white, I didn't really have the exposure that I would have had I lived in a city of some size where there was a considerable population of mixed ethnic groups.
Okay. Um, Looking back on events like Rosa Parks and other things such as that, um, do you think that it was a good thing that black people stood up for their rights at the time?
Would you repeat that, Ian?
With segregation, such as things like the Rosa Parks situation where the black people had to sit in the back of the bus, do you believe it was a good thing that they stood up for their rights at the time?
Do I think it was a good thing that the black people stood up for their rights? Is that your question?
Yep.
Uh, well, definitely. Definitely was a good thing. Uh, they're, they're human beings. They're created in God's image, just like everybody is. And uh, yeah, it was a good thing that there were a number of people uh, that had enough courage to be able to take that kind of a stand. And some of them, as history pointed out, paid a real price for it.
Yep. Are there any historical racial tensions that you know a lot about? If so, which ones and what happened?
Yeah, there's a story that was told to me that happened in 1930. My wife is from central Indiana, and um, in 1930, my wife's mother, who was a young girl, I think about 9 years old, witnessed a lynching in the state of Indiana, in the city of Marion, Indiana, a lynching of a black man.
Is there anything else that you can tell me about this story?
Um, I got the story secondhand. I know too that details of this story, some detail of the story, could still be found by going to a computer and typing in lynching in Marion, Indiana, 1930. Probably quite a bit of information would come out. I don't know if the people responsible for the lynching were ever held accountable for it or not.
Okay. Um, have you ever seen someone being persecuted in the 1950s because of their race? Please tell me about it. I understand you've already answered this question to some extent, but is there anything else that you've seen firsthand? You know, someone being persecuted because of their skin color?
Again, I led a very sheltered life growing up, and not around people of other ethnicity, of other ethnic backgrounds. So I uh, I really didn't witness abuse of people of other races, other than what I explained to you that I saw above the doors of restrooms when I was traveling from Michigan to to New Mexico in 1951. Uh,
When you were going to Mexico in 1951, and you saw that people had to go to a restroom based on their skin color, how did that make you feel?
um, I was 15 years old, and I know that I thought that's not right, but I didn't really have strong feelings about it, even though I knew it wasn't right.
Why do you think there was so much segregation and desegre and sorry, why do you think there was so much segregation and discrimination during this time against black people? Do you think it could have been prevented in any way?
Uh, I can't really speak knowledgeably about that question. Uh, I was as I said, I was very naive, having grown up in a community that was totally white, and the population made up probably 98% of people um, um, of Dutch extraction, and my family and my stepmother's family were probably uh, one of the very few ones of the very few families in our town that didn't have Dutch ancestry. And there were a few times when I was growing up where I thought that perhaps I might be uh, segregated against because I wasn't Dutch.
Yeah. Um, Going back to the question though, uh, with all these things, the Civil Rights Act, Rosa Parks, a lot of lynchings, the KKK in the 1950s, do you think any white person or anybody for this matter could have stepped up and prevented a lot of these things from happening?
Um, there's probably a lot, Ian, that we don't know about. There were probably a lot of people that were doing just what you were saying, and never got recognized for it. Uh, People that were standing up for the cause of justice.
Okay. Okay, here's a tough question for you. Do you believe that the 1950s racial tensions still have effect on today's society today in 2013?
Comparing 1950 to 2013, um, and trying to make tie points. Um, okay, in 1950 I was 14 years old, and obviously um, traveled a lot of miles that time, in the next in the years following that, and to try to draw comparisons. Again, not really being in an area, actually never really living in an area. Yes, I did too. Um, you're talking about blacks, all right? And in 1959, I moved from West Michigan to southeastern Kentucky. It was a culture very different from the culture that I grew up in. Very different. Um, in 1960, in 1960, 1961, my wife and I moved from the Midwest to New Mexico. Again, a much different culture. Many of the people there were descendants of the conquistadores. They were not Mexicans. If you called them Mexicans, it was an insult because they did not come from Mexico. They came from Spain. So there's some racial tension right there. Don't call me a Mexican. I'm not from Mexico. My ancestors came from Spain. And then in 1963, we again made a cultural change. We moved from New Mexico, where there was a lot of Spanish Americans. There was a lot of Native Americans, what we call Indian Americans, living there, and areas where I was in the minority. Okay, for the first time. Now I'm the minority. How do I function? How do I get along? How am I treated? And in southeastern Kentucky, the culture was very different from what I had grown up in. And how did I fit in? I'll tell you, Ian, as a first year school teacher, I learned many of their native folk tales, and I could tell them better than some of the natives could, and I was respected for that. And then we moved to Alaska, where we were working again. Now we're really in the minority, because we're teaching in a school with maybe 15 or 20 teachers and some staff people, and we've got 190 students that are all of a different race. So I'm in the minority, as I find myself in that particular environment there in Alaska. And again, in fact, we were warned, the kids are not going to like you. Just exactly the opposite was true. The kids loved us, and we got along very well. And one of the reasons we did, because we asked about their culture. These kids, Ian, came to school in the fall. It was a boarding school, and they stayed there all year. They never went home until the school's out. Didn't go home for Christmas. They stayed there all year. And a culture totally different from mine. And to me, it was a real privilege to live in that culture and to learn some things about that culture. However, Ian, my experience with different cultures was that I was in a position of leadership. I was an adult working with kids, and so it wasn't like I was on equal footing with them, because I was the teacher, and those populations really looked up to teachers. So I came in highly respected as a minority in their midst.
Okay. Thank you for sharing that. Is there anything else that you'd like to tell me about racism, segregation, or desegregation in the 1950s that you've heard about, experienced, or lived through?
I'm going to be redundant here, and just state again that came from a very sheltered background in the community that I grew up in West Michigan, and really didn't have much exposure to other cultures until I was an adult in a position of leadership working in other cultures. So it wasn't like I was coming in and I'm a new kid in the school, and I've got all these classmates that are a different culture, and so my perspective is certainly not typical of a person moving from culture to culture, because I'm being redundant now for about the third or fourth time, but I moved from culture to culture as a person of authority. I was a teacher. Yeah, and the cultures, especially the Indians, Eskimos, and Aleuts of Alaska, they just highly respected teachers. Um, so I think a lot of it has to do with how do you enter a culture? Are you coming in as a person with a college degree? Um, are you coming in on equal footing? And maybe that's kind of a crass way to say it when I use the term equal footing. But so I never I never had to go to a situation where uh, you know, where I had a whole where I was surrounded by peers that were of a different race. Now, as I stated, when I was teaching in different culture, uh, the few teachers that we had that were Caucasian were in the vast minority, but we ran the place.
Okay. Well, thank you for your time. Thank you for your interview. I really appreciate it. It's been nice to have you for an interview.
Uh, you're welcome, man. I appreciate the opportunity to share, and I hope that your project works out well for you. And um, racism, I'm sure that there are people that have a much better perspective over time about racism than I do, but I also have some unique things to share because having traveled and lived in several different cultures, it helps to give me a pretty good perspective of what those cultures are like, at least what they were like when I lived there. And obviously, my career started in 1959, and my teaching career. So we're looking at considerable length of time, more than 50 years.
Okay. Once again, thank you for your time and have a great day.
Thank you, Ian, and thank you for including me in your project. I hope it goes well for you. I'd be interested in knowing what some of your classmates come up with, too.
Okay. This is Ian Jones and Ted Curtis signing out.